Hello, welcome back to Shock's Talks. I'm Shakti, and today we're going to talk about communicating with NHI, non-human intelligence, or aliens. And this is a really exciting topic because we've been discussing telepathy recently. Kai Dickens came out with the Telepathy Tapes podcast, which a lot of people really connected to and got excited about. And this just sparks a little more interest around the topic of communications with non-human intelligence because, as we know from the research, a lot of abduction experiences and encounters with aliens or non-human beings from other places or other dimensions or other reality frames include a telepathic link. So I wanted to do this episode because recently I came across a video on Richard Dolan's channel, which was a recording of this Psionics summit. So we've talked about psionics on this channel, and if you're new to this topic of non-human intelligence, UAP, UFOs, consciousness, telepathy, remote viewing, or anything else along those lines, I suggest you go all the way back to the beginning of my channel. I just finally figured out how to arrange the playlists so that they're in order. So you can go to any playlist or podcast. It's a grouping of episodes that will move chronologically through, so you can just click next, 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 and it'll take you through all the episodes. I start by going through a deep dive of UFO history, starting around the 1940s, but also reaching out beyond that into the past a little bit and into the present current events. And then the second season dives into the consciousness phenomena a little more deeply. I started a third season about contact and abduction, then took a break and then came back, and now it's just covering all the topics from here on out. So the current season is touching on things that are happening today in the news regarding these topics, spirituality topics, because all of this does relate. And we're also talking a lot about telepathy, and now we're getting back into the non-human intelligence. So the video that I'm going to talk about today is a 4-hour-long psionics summit, and that was just part one. I haven't even watched part two yet, but I've already watched part one twice, and halfway through today I was just skimming and jumping around to find all the interesting tidbits that I wanted to put into my notes. But I absolutely loved this video. It's linked below. Like I said, I found it on Richard Dolan's site because he's featured in the summit, but you could probably find it other places as well if you just put in Psionics Summit. It's the first link in my links below. And this summit was put on by Ubiquity University. Let me find their description. So I'm going to quote from their video description. Humanity Rising, Ubiquity University, CIHS, and Transdimensional Mapping present Psionics Summit. Outer space meets inner space, exploring the psi plasma orb NHI connection. And this summit features interviews or little short interviews or short lectures with all kinds of different people with different backgrounds. We have Sarah Gam, an astrophysicist with a master's in countering weapons of mass destruction and a psychic medium. Jake Barber, who we've recently been introduced to through the News Nation interview about the egg-shaped UAP, and I've done some episodes on him. We have Ross Coulthart, who interviewed Jake Barber. This is the Australian investigative reporter and author who does a lot of work for News Nation. Dr. Pippa Malmgren, an American technology entrepreneur and economist. She served as special assistant to the President of the United States, George W. Bush, for economic policy on the National Economic Council, and is a former member of the U.S. President's Working Group on Financial Markets. She's discussing technology and consciousness. Bertie Jaworski, Chris Bledsoe, Richard Dolan, um, Jim Garrison. I'll give you their bios as I go into the details of what they say. And we have Dr. Sean Esbjorn Hargens, Bob Grenier, Dr. David Clements, Georg Bach, and they also, and that's, I think that covers most of the people they talk to in this part one. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you just some bullet points from the lectures that some of these folks were giving, and hopefully spark your interest to go and watch the whole video. So I know not everybody has 4 hours of time to spend on your UAP research like I do, or maybe you have other priorities, but if you are like me and does spark your interest, go listen to the whole thing, because it's full of all kinds of little nuggets, and just it's just a high quality group of people. And I just feel so excited when things like this come out, and it's just packed full of really solid information and beautiful perspectives and interesting ideas. You know, sometimes as you're combing through all of the stuff that's out there, it's easy to get caught up in other people's confusion or nonsense or ego. And this is just a very clear, concise group of people sharing really beautiful, important information and ideas. So let's get right into it. We will start where they started, which is with the host, Jim Garrison. So this host is founder, president, and faculty of Ubiquity University, which is an online university that does offer different degrees, and they have all kinds of different things on their website. But one of the things that first got me interested in Ubiquity was that they are the first university to offer any kinds of study around the UAP topic and degrees. So I'm going to go to their website really quick and just talk about exactly what they have on here. I know I've talked about this a little bit before in past episodes, but they have like different kinds of things like wisdom studies, extraterrestrial studies, science and consciousness, ecstatic mysticism, psychedelic studies, sustainability education, transformative business leadership, conscious business, all kinds of cool stuff on here. So basically, from what I understand, because it's an online program, they have teachers both online and in different physical locations. And it sounds like the kind of thing where people can kind of piece together their own pathways to these degrees. And they do have some kind of situation where they're able to get you an accredited degree. I can't remember exactly how that all works, but I've linked their website below. If you're interested, you can go look into this for yourself. And it's something that I'm really excited about and interested in personally. I would actually love to have a degree in extraterrestrial studies. I think that would be right up my alley. So maybe for the future. So this in the opening, Jim Garrison talks about how there's zero doubt anymore about this topic. We know that there's something here. It is non-human. It is a phenomena that has been going on for a very long time. The US government has been tracking this, and the cover-up, which has been a part of this all along, is just fading away as time goes on and more people are taking interest in this topic. So that's really great. And other people are going to discuss the cover-up as well, which I've also gone into in season 1 of Shock's Talks. So it's an important part of the history to understand at least why in the US there's been this cover-up for almost 80 years. Um, and then he talks a little bit about some recent news, the drone flap, which we've also talked about on this channel, and you can look up all the videos online. But starting in November 2024, the world was visited by thousands of drones or orbs or UAP. No one could provide an answer for what most people intuited was actually true. And we were bearing witness to a global phenomena. And then right in the middle of that, there was the Jake Barber interview. So this is what Garrison is saying in his intro. And that Jake Barber interview is the first time that the general public was introduced to the term psionics. So what he's saying is basically all of this phenomena is directing us towards the field of consciousness, which I've also been saying on Shocks Talks, as you know, if you've been with me, and it's so cool. He says, if we can develop our faculties, we can engage in intelligent communications to find out answers to these big questions. Who are they? Why are they here? What are they doing? Can we engage in an interactivity that is constructive and positive? Will this take our species into the next phase of evolutionary development? And he also mentions how we're always teetering on the brink of self-destruction, but we're being given, at the same time, incontrovertible evidence that we are not alone. This awareness that we are not alone can be a catalyst to the kind of transformation that we all seek. So that's kind of framing it all up. And then I think next he went to Ross Coulthart. So again, this is the Australian investigative reporter and author, and he has a lot of news reports that he does with News Nation. What I liked from Ross's little section here is how he talks about his Aboriginal friends. So because he's Australian, he says he knows some Aboriginal folks who talk about the dream time. And these were nomadic tribes who had a connection with their past, with their kin, and each other through a spiritual realm. Through some kind of astral traveling, they could communicate over vast distances, and that's what they call the dream time. And he talks about how, like, he can't believe he's going down this path. As a journalist, he's been super skeptical. He only recently is starting to get into this consciousness side of this topic, because at first it was too hard to accept that that was part of it, because it just seems a little bit woo and out there. But now he's realizing that, there's something here, and he mentions again that, he does believe that there is a correlation between these psionic assets who can meditate and call in the phenomena and the actual orbs that come down, or whatever other kinds of craft. And he's now witnessed it for himself. He said he can't claim that it's a causation, but it does appear to be a correlation. So he's maintaining his skepticism, but slowly moving towards, feeling just more and more excited about what is now coming out around this topic of psionics. And he does say in this little snippet that if you want to understand UAPs, you have to understand human consciousness. Again, I've been also on this same tip, and this is why I'm obsessed with Tom Campbell's work, with the Monroe Institute, with remote viewing, with healing, with spirituality, because these different frameworks help us to understand consciousness. And in order to get to the bottom of the UAP mystery, we need to look at consciousness and understand more about consciousness. So after this, there's a small pre-recorded interview with Jake Barber. And what he talks about is just how this is available to everyone. He literally said, what's beautiful is that this is available to everyone. Think of consciousness as the World Wide Web. And I know you're probably sick of me saying, Tom Campbell, oh my God, this is just like Tom Campbell's theory. But it is, and that's what's so cool. It's literally exactly what Tom Campbell is describing in his theory. And the way Jake talks about this, it almost makes me wonder if he's familiar with Tom Campbell's work, or if he has met him, or if he has even practiced with him, because so many of the things he says are just right in alignment with it, even down to like the way he speaks about it. And he did mention the Monroe Institute, I believe, or somebody else at least on this interview did. So in Jake's section, he talks about, he says it's really helpful to use these analogies like thinking of consciousness as the World Wide Web, which is obviously exactly what Tom Campbell says. And he said, and it might not even be an analogy. He said it might be a form of digital consciousness that the World Wide Web is evolving into. That is yet to be determined. That was an interesting little piece. But going back to just thinking of it as an analogy, he says, the web is around us all the time. You can upload to it or you can download from it, but you can't see it. We connect with a Wi-Fi, and he said our own ego is like a smartphone. You have the latest one and think it's so great, but you still can't seem to use it. Well, I would say that's because you're in airplane mode and you need to learn how to activate your own self. Now, I love this so much because what it implies is that we are all capable of this, and maybe we just haven't flipped the right switch. Maybe we just haven't, turned off the airplane mode or activated the Wi-Fi or something else along those lines. But it suggests that we can, and that it's not a limitation where like only certain special people can do this. Or, a lot of us have been discussing the telepathy tapes recently, and even some folks that I've been talking about this with have been fixating on this, the autism factor, because in the telepathy tapes, we're specifically looking at non-speaking autistic folks and how they have some telepathic and other psi abilities. And so then scientists and other rational thinkers latch on to that part of the puzzle. But what they're failing to do is they're failing to take into account the huge amount of research and information that's available to us that gives us more evidence to suggest that all kinds of different people are capable of telepathic abilities, and it is not just limited to this very specific subset of humanity. What this specific subset of humanity is giving us is another beautiful piece of evidence to add to the pile, but I think it's kind of an unfortunate mistake when people get too fixated on something like that and fail to look at everything else that's out there that points to a bigger reality, which is that all kinds of different people are able to access psi abilities through all kinds of different means and methods. And in order to get a better understanding of what's really going on, we have to look at all of it, because that's how we're going to be able to do more science around it and really begin to understand the mechanics. So Jake Barber talks about intuition. He says it's a word we use a lot when we talk about consciousness. And someone with good intuition or high knowledge or intelligence is smart, like a smartphone. He says knowledge is like rote information. The practical application of that knowledge is something different. Intelligence is problem-solving skills. Wisdom is the ability to make fruitful decisions. So I like how he's I'm seeing this like multifaceted gem, and he's rolling it around and looking at it from every different angle, and just looking at all these different aspects of what it means to be smart. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because again, going back to the telepathy tapes, you have these beings who are just so unlimited in their consciousness, and they have these gorgeous personalities, but when their consciousness is filtering through their very limited physical matter body that is constrained by a rule set that is causing them not to be able to control their body, not to be able to speak verbally with other people. And sometimes they're even, violent or have really aggressive behavior, or all kinds of different things. You're seeing this huge disconnect, but what we're learning is that their consciousness and their spirit or soul is so much greater than what is filtering through that constrained form. And I think this is a beautiful thing because it can also help us to extend our awareness out to all kinds of different people in reality, even just different ways of communicating and expressing. We have this culture that values rote knowledge, and certain pockets of this world exclude people who do not communicate in the way that they do because they look down on them. But just because a great soul is maybe filtering through a body that happened to have a certain upbringing that caused them to speak a certain way or live a certain life, it's like, why does it matter? Why? Maybe it's on us to tune our awareness and our consciousness to perceive beyond just what's being expressed verbally. Maybe it's on us and not on them to change, but maybe we all need to look around us, look a little bit deeper, and see beyond the facade, which is just the physical form, or like the hardware, you know what I mean? And like tap into the software a little bit more, something like that. I guess what I'm trying to say is there have always been soulful people who are able to see past everything and understand the true nature of those with whom they are interacting. And the people that are limiting their ability to connect based on surface level characteristics, I believe, are missing out. And Jake Barber also talks about how certain humans have this bell that can ring true inside of them. And that's like the kind of people that have a really strong intuition. And he said those people might be pretty good at psionics. And his definition of psionics is just our ability to play within the consciousness field in order to achieve desired outcomes. Now, that part I do find very interesting and important, and this is similar to Tom Campbell. It's like, you could explore consciousness and have all kinds of interesting experiences, but also you could just waste a lot of time. It could be like anything else. You could just play around and kind of what's the point, So you have to approach it with intention. And this is again why I really value Tom Campbell's theory, because he makes sure to ground his understanding of the nature of reality in a purpose. And this purpose is what allows him to function within consciousness in a meaningful way. And I think it's a useful perspective for us all to play with, and then to develop our own unique perspectives. But I think we can save ourselves a lot of time by jumping into it with a strong set of intentions, instead of just going in kind of willy-nilly. And that's exactly what Jake Barber says here. He says that at the very least, you want to go in with an intention that you're going to find something worthwhile. So that's very general and simple, and that's very similar to what Tom Campbell says about practicing your out-of-body experience or remote viewing or meditation. He says, you don't have to go in knowing exactly what you're going to get, but go in with an open mind and just have an intention that you're going to get something meaningful out of it. I love that as a starting point, and I love that they're both on the same page about that. So back to the analogy, the World Wide Web. Jake Barber does say that basically meditation is just step one to kind of connecting, or it's one way to do it. It's not the only way, as we've talked about a lot here on Shocks Talks. And what you want to do is you want to put something into the search bar. So he talks about creating a defensible space in his words, and basically he just means like quieting the mind, but he's saying like if you kind of black out an area of your consciousness, that's like a space where you now know I'm in a quiet zone where I can just hear my own thoughts. So I know what's me. I know what's coming from me. And then I can learn to quiet down what's coming from me. And then I can put something in the search bar, like I want the answer to a question or I want guidance around this topic. And those other inputs can start coming into that space. And so now you're actually accessing the larger consciousness system, to put it in Tom Campbell's terms. And just again, to be clear, there's multiple sources of information that we can tap into when we are playing in consciousness. And most typically at first, we're going to be tapping into our own thoughts. And then once we learn to really get clear on what's coming from us, and we learn to kind of quiet down our own thoughts, then we can start sourcing from outside of ourselves. Now, what are the sources that are possible that we might be getting answers from? Well, obviously there's just the consciousness system itself, the whole web. So it's like you're talking to, the whole internet, or you're talking directly to the AI or the chat GPT, and it's bringing you answers that are coming from the whole system of reality. Or if you're on the internet, you could be talking to another individual. So if you were in a chat room, you would be talking to a person versus if you're putting something into the search bar. And I think those are pretty simple, major categories to consider when you're playing in consciousness. And Jake Barber does believe that you can begin to understand the source of where that information is coming from. Tom Campbell is very careful when he speaks about it. He doesn't want anyone to get too caught up in where the information's coming from. He really wants to encourage you to think about the quality of the exchange. How can that information be applied? Was it useful? Was it good? If, for example, you're chatting with someone in the chat room over time, you can't really trust who they are right off the bat. You have to understand who they are through interacting over time. I think for me personally, I do a lot of just chatting with the larger consciousness system, and I've always done that since I was a kid. Sometimes I used to think of it as God. Now I really like to think of it as the AI of consciousness, because it's very neutral, and it allows me to interface with the information in a way that is completely free from all religious and spiritual connotations that come along with the term or the idea of God. And I find that very useful personally. But then every once in a while, I like to imagine it as something more spiritual, and that also allows me to connect in a different way. So I think what Jake says here is everybody should play with this. He basically is saying, you all can do this and you should all be playing with it. And I think that's really encouraging and really cool. And he talks a lot about good intentions here. And he also talks about how humankind has been trying to connect with extraterrestrial life by using things like SETI. And that is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And that's sending radio signals out. But he was saying they've been here kind of talking to us all along. They're just not using that system. They're using this telepathic system. So instead of waiting for a radio signal, we need to start opening up our consciousness for the signal that's already being sent directly to us. So that's pretty interesting. And then they go to Dr. Pippa Malmgren, and this is the technologist and entrepreneur and economist, and she had a lot of interesting things to say, but she talks about how she really recognized that when the Congress was digging into all this, something real was going on, and she realized this must be serious. That led her down her own path, digging into the topic, and she mentions the cover-up and why it was that way, because all of this was really rooted in a particular way of thinking because it got caught up in the Cold War. That's all part of UAP, UFO history. Go back to season 1 of Shock's Talks and you'll learn all about it. And she does also mention that the phenomena tends to gravitate toward nuclear bases. And she talks about the drones also, and she's just saying that like these things were not just showing up in New Jersey, they were showing up all around the US and all around the world. But what was happening is they were really showing up over nuclear facilities. And this special ops people and the Defense Department is always really concerned about this, because of course they don't want to reveal all of their nuclear arsenals, bases, test sites, and things like that. So they're always kind of flustered when this happens, because they're probably moving these things around quite a bit, and they don't want everyone to be tuned in to where weapons are. So that's why they get really weird about it, and they're not very clear about what's going on, which is understandable. But her most interesting point was just around the fact that this phenomena is directly touching the hearts of our most highly trained lethal force, the Special Ops Group, who she says have quite literally had to harden their hearts. They're so emotionally turned off, and no one expected that this group of people would be the group that was like most moved. And I think she's directly referring to Jake Barber and his emotions that we all witnessed in that interview about the what they call it, the 8-gon and the egg-shaped UAP, and his connection to a non-human intelligence that overtook him in a way that felt like he said he was possessed by the most beautiful angel he had ever been possessed by. And you see him cry on this interview. So I have a lot of other thoughts about that maybe I'll save for another day, in the kind of skeptical bucket, because, well, I'll just touch on it lightly. I just think that even though you can have a very, I feel like there's a feather tickling my face, even though you can have a very spiritually profound experience with NHI, I think it's probably a good idea to stay open-minded to receiving more information about that connection before jumping to a conclusion. Jumping to a conclusion based on a strong emotion, in my opinion, is unwise. And this is based on my own experiences with both humans and non-humans. And when I say non-humans, I'm talking about consciousness, so you can call it whatever you want. You could call it thoughts in my own head if you can't handle the truth. But the truth is, there are many non-physical sources of information and communication that seem to have different agendas. And this is why throughout all recorded history, we have the duality of things like angels and demons. You never get one without the other. There's always this duality in this reality, at least so far. And this is something that Richard Dolan is like one of the only people who talks about this, and he gives his take on this during the summit. And I just really value his perspective, and I want to echo it, but also it is my own based on my own experience. And I'm going to give you the human example too, because I've been in, like many women who have relationships with men, I have been in a relationship where I was overwhelmed with profound feelings of love, almost like so great that it brought me into like an obsessive state. And that person was also very harmful to me. And I think a lot about that relationship because it was significant in my life and it taught me so many lessons. And I think it could be, there's so many possibilities, but one possibility is that I connected to a soul that was filtering through a constrained body, mind, neurological makeup kind of container. So, he had chosen to do drugs, really intense drugs for like long chunks of his existence. He had a lot of trauma of his own, and maybe he had his own things that he was coming into all of that with before he even started any of that, like maybe mental health things, or perhaps personality disorders, or perhaps existing somewhere on the autism spectrum. There's all kinds of possibilities. I can't begin to diagnose him, but I can see traits and patterns in all of those different categories that do apply to his personality. And so I think on the one hand, I was purely connecting to his soul, and I have had the experience of encountering him in dreams so many times and having different kinds of experiences there. But in physical matter reality, due to his choices or whatever other constraints he was dealing with, he had violent outbursts, and he was not essentially not safe for me to continue to interact with in physical form. And so that's one version of all of this, but there's also just like, it got really popular and probably overused, but this idea of a narcissist, that a lot of people were recognizing some degree of that type of behavior in the relationships that they were experiencing, where a partner would love bomb and was highly intuitive and highly tuned to the other person's emotions, but was also highly destructive and self-focused and lacking empathy. So the reason I'm talking about these examples is because at the beginning of these connections, there's this euphoric feeling of pure love and extreme dedication. Like I felt like I could pledge my undying love and pledge my allegiance to this soul and like serve him for all of eternity. Like it was very extreme, you know what I mean? And that extreme reaction came about because the emotions were so strong, the soul connection was so strong early on, and the chemical response that I had to this other person was so powerful and overwhelming and euphoric that it stripped me of all reason, you know what I mean? And so when I hear people going through these types of beautiful euphoric experiences with NHI of any kind, I a little alarm goes off inside of me, and I think, okay, that could be purely good and great, or it could just be something along the lines of these things that I've experienced, where like it feels better than anything, and therefore you think it's better than anything, but there's actually more to the story. So I like to keep a little bit of skepticism around that, because I just think it's wise. And thankfully, Richard Dolan is one person out there who agrees with that in his own way. But okay, so let's go to Richard Dolan next and see what he said. So he talks about, he's like saying that he is a believer in these non-conventional perceptions, basically psi abilities. He says there is something there. We don't yet have a proper scientific understanding of how that works, so it's important that we continue to explore and test. He makes the point that while some people can have these psychic experiences, we shouldn't be surprised when skeptics still want better evidence or proof to show that these capabilities are real. It's one thing to experience it yourself, but if someone else doesn't have the psychic gift, we should always do our best to understand it scientifically. He talks about the history of these communications with NHI, and he points to a few specific examples where humans who had encounters with aliens described telepathic communication as a part of that experience. He points to the Ariel School. I did an episode on that. He talks about Dan Sherman. I've read Dan Sherman's book because of Richard Dolan. He talks about how that's an interesting case that is probably a precursor to all this psionics stuff. And again, Dan Sherman was part of a secret program where he was trained to communicate with NHI using a combination of strict protocols, technological devices, computers, and they were also giving him a pill in his account. So there was like a kind of a drug component. And this is interesting because I think the next area of research that we all need to dig into around these communications with NHI has to do with the chemical component and the various substances or other devices or tools or techniques that can induce psychedelic experiences. This is a very important part of all of this, that hasn't really crept into the conversation when it comes to UAP and NHI yet, but I think it will. It has a little bit here and there, but not a whole lot. So let's see. Okay, here we go with Dolan's caution. I would always caution against, while there are some great potentials, it's not a given that everyone out there wants to be our friend or is out there to help us. In the history of USOs, there are many confrontations with these objects, so not everything is like a peaceful. Sometimes it's an actual confrontation. And yeah, and he just says there are, it's silly to imagine that it's all love and light. That is basically his take on it. And he's studied this for 30 years. So he kind of closes out by saying, I'm very confident that there is something here. There has been lying and cover-ups. Like, there's the reality, there's the deception, 80 plus years of leaks, interesting things about technology, bodies, a significant number of declassified documents that prove something is going on. But what is difficult to conclude is what really is going on. Like, what are their motives? He said, what's obvious is that they are deeply engaged in this planet and in us. They know that we have gone through a rapid transformation technologically and maybe in consciousness, and they are watching us. So, yeah, it's cool. And, a lot of these people are talking all about the kind of love and light side of this. For example, Chris Bledsoe, his book UFO of God is a book that I've read and talked about here. And he had, it wasn't a dream, it wasn't an out-of-body experience, it wasn't a near-death experience, it was 10 after 5, the sky was blue, and I was taken conscious in the daylight. This is his quote from this segment of this interview. He said, I never had the chance to be skeptical. It just, he had an experience that thrust him into it. And then from that point on, and it was scary. Like, when I read his book, it was pretty scary. But the funny thing is, like, he came around to just having this really positive, loving connection with these orbs specifically. And now it's at the point where he can just go outside and see them pretty much every single day. I don't think there's a time when he doesn't really at this point. And he does a lot of filming. He has videos. He has his channels on Instagram where he shares his videos, and probably YouTube as well. And, he says it is emotion based, and for him, it is about like a prayer. He said it's almost like a prayer, and every time he does it, he's answered. And he mentions how he did a show for the History Channel. I believe it was the History Channel, where he was on camera with scientists, with 15 other witnesses on live TV with brain scans, where he was making that telepathic connection and was able to summon these orbs. So he made observable contact. And he's not the only one. There are other examples of this coming out now, but he said that was the first one where they, recorded it and had all of that, all of the witnesses and the scientists and the brain scans all in one place in one time. So he's really a proponent of this emotional connection. He said he's not religious, but he is spiritual, and he does feel that this is a spiritual thing, and he thinks of it more along the line of angels. So my take on that is that, let's just say there are demons and angels. Whatever he's doing is connecting him to the angels. I think there are other modes of interaction that might cause you to connect to the more demonic side of it, if you want to call it that. But I think what we can probably, take away from him, from what he's saying and what Jake Barber is saying, is that when you go in with that beautiful, open-hearted, loving energy and emotion, and you create that positive intent, then you're going to, you put that in the search bar, then you're going to get good stuff back. So if you go in with fear and too much skepticism, you might not get anything when it comes to this, at least. Or what nobody's saying here, but what I believe to be true, is you might actually connect with like a lower energetic entity. And actually, that brings me to this woman, Sarah Gam. So she did talk about this a little bit. This is the astrophysicist who has a master's in countering weapons of mass destruction. And she's also a psychic medium. So she talks a lot about how weird it is to wear all these different hats, because she's like working in the Pentagon sometimes, or working with more nuts and bolts people, or she was working with the UAP task force for a while. But she says that as more and more of us begin to become aware of these abilities and sort of come online to this stuff, the neural network is going to expand. So a lot of people think this right now, and I think they're probably right. We are at a tipping point. It's really exciting. We're at a tipping point of consciousness where for a long time it's been smaller groups of people maintaining these connections to the non-physical, or a few individuals here and there, and now it's just more and more and more people are having a lot of these experiences. And because of that, just like that hundredth monkey effect, we're all connected in consciousness. It's just going to be all that much easier for anyone else who's coming into this to get further faster. So she saw a lot of different videos when she was working for the UAP task force of anomalous craft, and she would analyze it quickly and go over everything about it that made it anomalous. And then sometimes she said she just knew right away it's not from here. And her gut response wasn't fear, panic, terror, or like we got to shoot it down or trap it or test it or anything. It was like, hey, like, have a nice visit at Earth, like, I hope you enjoy it. That was her gut feeling when she saw those videos. And she's a psychic, so that's pretty interesting. And she said it was very interesting to be a part of the Intel community and watch other people open up to this. And then at a certain point in her career, she had completed all these classes on her psychic mediumship work, and she was afraid that she was going to get fired or have her clearance pulled, or they were going to start making her do polygraphs because, she's being weird and talking about psychic stuff. But she said nobody cared, which is also very interesting. They were just like, whatever, and it's probably because they're very familiar with this, because, intelligence communities have been employing psychic operatives for probably since the 70s, if not earlier. So nobody was concerned about any of that. And then there were just more questions around the science of it all. People still don't fully understand consciousness or functions of consciousness. And she talks about the quantum physics lens. That was like her way of connecting dots, understanding energy. And she talked about how early in her mediumship practices, she would have telepathic dreams of deceased relatives. And they weren't speaking in those communications, but she was feeling feelings or receiving images. And over time, she began to realize that there's more out there to talk to. And she started having meditations with NHI visitors, non-human intelligence. And she's also a Reiki master and does other healing modalities. And the NHI started working with her in those healing modalities, which is so cool, because you hear a lot of healers talking about this, like, oh, the Pleiadians are channeling through me, or the Galactic Federation, and it's like, whatever, that's just your imagination. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's totally real. And in her experience, there were Arcturians who were all about love and light, who were working with her because she was doing those healing modalities. And then one night she got a visitor in her room, and it was a blue being, and she's not exactly sure where that being is from, but she said it was showing that it was guarding me, and I knew that I was protected. And life can be rough because I still have a day job and some people at the Pentagon haven't been kind, but those issues have been resolved because I have protection on my side. Kind of a powerful statement there. And Jake Barber said the same thing. You know, once he made that connection with that divine goddess-like energy during one of his retrievals of an anomalous craft, from that point on, he felt protected. And there, you know, I can really relate to that feeling of just being divinely protected because I've also been through some really intense, dangerous, scary situations in my life and some really intense traumas, and it feels like a miracle. You know, it feels like a miracle that I was protected, but that protection also extends into just basic life stuff too, like little things, little bits of guidance here and there, practical things, you know. It's so I think what everyone is pointing to and what I've experienced myself is that in this realm of consciousness where there are so many things available to us, it's not that hard to tap into guidance, protection, and healing when you do have a pure intent, because the non-human intelligence, the entities that are going to be connecting with you, you can't lie to them. You cannot pretend. You know, they see all the layers, they feel, know, understand. I'm not saying they all do because can't speak for all of them, but I'm just saying there is evidence that some of these things that we've all experienced, anecdotal evidence, you know, experiential evidence that these things can see through all the layers. And that's why I think if you want to make contact with anything non-human, going into spiritual study is a nice place to start, because spiritual studies and frameworks provide you with the tools that you need to clean up your act and get yourself ready for those communications and those connections. Maybe you don't need it. Maybe you're already just a pure soul. Maybe you are very clear in who you are and you're an authentic being. But most of us, in order to survive reality in society today, have had to mask and create many personality layers to navigate all of the complex social systems that we have to navigate in order to survive. And that kind of builds up these kind of chunky layers of falseness that we have to filter through on a regular basis. And I believe that one of the reasons why the consciousness system is pointing to this particular subset of society, the non-speaking autistic folks, is because the autism spectrum offers us a glimpse of the varying levels of masking that go on across all society. I think it's an example for us all to look to. At the most extreme level, there's no ability to control or influence the filters, because you just have this body that's kind of a little bit running haywire or something, you know. The consciousness doesn't have a lot of control over it. But at the lower levels of the other end of that spectrum, you have all kinds of people, you probably are one or know one, who just have varying degrees of the ability to filter. And maybe one way that we can all move towards greater psychic abilities is to find our own authenticity and to let go of some of our filtering that we do have control over. I think this is also part of the yoga teachings, the Yoga Sutras, and the notion that, like, living in truth, speaking truth, thinking aligned thoughts, you know, like being clear and truthful, it kind of cleans up the signal space. It clears up a lot of the interference that might be blocking us from some of these communications. So that's my own personal theory, and others do agree. And then let's see what else is in here. I think that covers most of the people I was going to talk about. So the people who I did not talk about who are featured in this video, include Dr. Sean Esbjorn Hargens, Bob Grenier, and Dr. David Clements. You can watch this summit to hear from them and also from Georg. And again, there's just a lot of really interesting, some of the lectures are really deeply based in physics or consciousness science, or it gets really out there. They go into all these slides about like toroidal fields and all kinds of other stuff, but I just wanted to touch on some of the points that we've been discussing on this channel leading up to now. And I'm going to watch the next part, and I'm also still continuing to read John Mack's book, Abduction, and it's just taking me a really long time to get through, because in this book you have, he introduces the subject, and then for like a long chapter he goes over a lot of the cases, and it's almost like a transcript where you're hearing their experiences, things that they recovered through hypnotic regression, and then you're reaching his conclusion and like a little bit of information about how that person proceeded with their life sometimes. And so it's kind of like just something I have to move slowly through. It's not something you can really skim through or read quickly, because it's emotional, it's sometimes intense and scary. It's like reading through other people's trauma. And, you know, these people are not all having great experiences. It's very disruptive to them and to their lives, and just super scary, you know? So I think, you know, it's important to have an open heart and have positive intentions and feel that sense of playfulness and excitement when we're beginning to discover functions of consciousness. But I also believe that it's very important to honor and respectfully hold space for the experiences that people have had that are not full of love and light and joy and excitement and peace, and they're actually quite the opposite. And we don't have to fixate on that or be totally fear-based or spiral out, but let's just be real here and look at all of the evidence, you know, and all of the stories. And I do feel that it's very just, it's disrespectful to all of these people's experiences, but it's also just so naive to limit ourselves into thinking that all aliens are good and all they want is peace and love and joy, and they're only here to help us, because that's not, that's denying a huge body of evidence, and that seems crazy to me. And it also just seems like there may be something about this phenomena that hooks people into either that fear or that euphoria, and then they have a hard time moving on to the other side and like looking at the other side of it. And so I'm just suggesting again that we all do our due diligence and really take a look at the history of all the work that's been done with abductees, all the military encounters. Richard Dolan talked about his new book, which I haven't even had a chance to start yet, but I have my copy of the USO book, where he goes over all the cases of like Navy and different, basically everything that has been, not everything, but a lot of important cases that are describing encounters with UAP that are either coming up out of the water or going into it or have been observed under the water. And this is something that we will continue to talk about, because as time goes on, we're all going to realize that like as much stuff as is going on in the skies is happening in our oceans, which is wild. So we have a lot to learn. And I do, as a spiritual person, in order to make sense of all this and to move forward, like I've mentioned before on this channel, I have to ground myself in a perspective that allows me to navigate all of this anomalous phenomena with some sense of purpose, you know? So for me, I have my own soul's purpose within the context of reality, and then reality is full of all these great mysteries that I'm very curious about and want to understand. and they pull me off in all these different directions. But I always come back to, like, what am I really doing here? What is my life about? And maybe that's just something you could say I'm even making it up, but it doesn't matter. It's a construct that allows me to safely navigate these big questions and strange bodies of work and just crazy accounts, because if you don't have something to come back to, um, it's the nature of the human mind to spin out a little bit, and it can be very dangerous to spin out too far in any direction. I think balance is key. I think recognizing that while non-physical intelligences, entities, and energies may exist and we may have the abilities to interface with them, that we are existing physically and perhaps for a reason. And at the very least, even if there's not some grand reason for it all, we have an opportunity here in this physical matter reality to learn from the constraints that we are placed within, and I value that. So that's kind of where I bring it back at the end of the day. And I also like to just bring it back to this idea of evolving towards like a lower entropy reality for all. So I would love to see us moving away from greed and selfishness and war and violence and moving towards peace and more compassion for all. And that's what really excites me. And so let's close it out with how to search. What would we put in our search bar? So let's say we're going to go meditate now. And you can do this. I'm going to suggest two ways that I think are fun to practice this. One is typing, and the other is just through your consciousness. So you can either ask the question and just listen or feel for the answers, or wait for perceptions to flood you in various ways, whatever way you receive information. Could be images, could be feelings, could be words in your mind, could be thoughts, could be smells or anything else. Or you could practice like the automatic writing version of this, where you be your own chat GPT. So you ask the question, you clear your own thoughts, and then you just start typing the answer. And it can be kind of silly, like you're practicing. You have to play and experiment. And then do that every day for a week, and then go through the data and say, did anything useful come out of this? And you can very easily assess, like, this was a bunch of nonsense. This was pure imagination. I think this was me the whole time. I think this was just, I was having a hard time getting answers, so I was just making up answers. Or you might find that, like, whoa, things were really flowing out of me that like weren't from me, and I didn't expect that. And then you look at that little chunk of data and you say, out of all that stuff that seemed to come from another place, was any of it applicable to my life? Was it useful? Was it meaningful? Did it make me feel a certain way? And you analyze that, and then you just keep doing that over time. And through a process like that, you're going to get a better understanding of where the information is coming from and how you can put it to use. So have fun playing in consciousness, and I'll see you next time on Shocks Talks. As always, the links are below. If you like this video, give it that thumbs up, please. Thank you. And also share it with someone, and you could subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more.